There is a morning ritual so old it predates every religion you've ever been taught to trust. So precise, so structured, so deliberately constructed that when you first encounter it in the original texts, you don't feel like you're reading history. You feel like you're being watched. Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, writing, and the measurement of time. He wasn't worshipped the way the others were. He was consulted. There's a difference. You don't just pray to Thoth. You align yourself with him, or you don't bother. For 90 days, I ran his forbidden morning ritual. Not a modern wellness version, not a crystals and affirmations repackaging, the actual framework, drawn from Hermetic texts, the Egyptian Book of Thoth, and the oldest known priestly protocols connected to his temples at Hermopolis. What happened during those 90 days didn't just surprise me. Some of it genuinely unsettled me. And some of it changed how I understand the relationship between the human mind and the nature of time itself. But before I get into any of that, you need to understand why this ritual was hidden, why it was called forbidden, and who exactly didn't want you practicing it, because that context changes everything. Stay with me. Most people, when they hear the name Thoth, picture the ibis-headed figure standing in the background of Egyptian tomb paintings, quill in hand, recording the weight of a soul. A scribe, a cosmic bureaucrat. That image is accurate, but it is dangerously incomplete. Thoth was not simply a recorder of events. He was, according to the oldest Hermetic tradition, the architect of the system that makes events possible in the first place. Language, mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, the ancient Egyptians attributed all of it to Thoth. Not metaphorically, literally. They believed he spoke the world into measurable existence, that consciousness and calculation were the same act. His cult center was Hermopolis, called Kmun in the Old Tongue, meaning City of the Eight. That number wasn't decorative. The 8 primordial forces the Egyptians called the Ogdoad, darkness, water, invisibility, and eternity, each in masculine and feminine pairs, were said to have existed before creation, and Thoth was the intelligence that organized them into something coherent, into a cosmos. Now here is where it gets interesting, because Thoth wasn't just revered, he was also feared. Not in the horror movie sense, in the way that genuine precision frightens people who prefer comfortable vagueness. His system demanded exactness. His priests weren't allowed to practice his rites casually. There were protocols. There were purifications. There were times of day that were permitted and times of day that were not. And there were portions of his teaching, particularly those dealing with what the texts call the operation of the hour, that were restricted. Not for public use, not for the uninitiated. The Greek tradition would later absorb Thoth and rename him Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great. Why thrice? Because he was said to be the greatest philosopher, the greatest priest, and the greatest king simultaneously. The Hermetic corpus, those famous dialogues that sparked the Renaissance's occult revival, carries his fingerprints throughout. The phrase, "as above, so below," that gets slapped on wellness posters and tattooed on forearms, that's a Hermetic principle. Originally, it wasn't a vibe. It was a precise technical statement about the correspondence between cosmic patterns and human experience. So why were his practices buried? Multiple reasons, and they compound across history in a way that's difficult to untangle cleanly. First, the Roman suppression of Egyptian religious practice. When Rome converted to Christianity in the 4th century, the old temple complexes were shuttered, defaced, or repurposed. The priestly lineages that maintained the oral components of Thothian practice were broken. What survived did so in manuscripts, many of which were deliberately mislabeled, hidden in monastery libraries, or written in deliberately obscure symbolic language designed to confuse anyone without the proper interpretive key. Second, and this is the part that tends to get overlooked, the priests themselves suppressed certain practices. Not out of malice, but out of a principle the Hermetic tradition calls the law of preparation. The idea that specific techniques, applied without the right foundation, don't just fail to work, they actively destabilize the practitioner. The morning ritual I spent 90 days running falls into exactly this category. It was kept from general circulation not because someone wanted power over others, but because the ancients believed, with complete sincerity, that an unprepared mind engaging with it was like handing a precise surgical instrument to someone who'd never studied anatomy. Third, and most recently, the 19th and early 20th century occult revival that reintroduced Hermetic ideas to the Western world did so with significant distortion. The Rosicrucians, the Theosophists, the Golden Dawn, all serious organizations with serious scholars among them, also had institutional incentives to present certain practices as more esoteric and guarded than they needed to be. Mystery sells, accessibility doesn't. So layers of unnecessary mystification were added around some of the most practically applicable material in the entire tradition. I'm Daniel, and this is Hermetic Talk. And the reason I wanted to spend time on this history before we get into the ritual itself is that context is not optional here. If you walk into Thoth's morning practice thinking it's a meditation routine with an interesting backstory, you will either dismiss it too quickly or misapply it entirely. Understanding why it was hidden tells you what it's actually for. Let me be clear about something before I describe this. I am not going to give you a step-by-step guide formatted like a self-help listicle. That framing would betray the material entirely. What I'm going to do is walk you through the structural logic of the ritual, the why behind each component, because that's the only version of this that's actually useful. The ritual draws primarily from three source traditions. The first is the Hermetic text known as the Book of Thoth, fragments of which survive in various forms and have been reconstructed with varying degrees of scholarly credibility. The second is the Leiden Papyrus and related Egyptian magical papyri, which contain priestly morning invocations directly addressed to Thoth in his solar aspect. And the third is a body of material from the Nag Hammadi library, specifically the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, which describes an initiatory practice of ascending through consciousness states that maps almost precisely onto what the Egyptian temple protocols were attempting. These three streams converge on a single core idea, that the moment of waking, the transition from sleep to consciousness, is not a passive biological event. It is a threshold. And how you cross that threshold determines the quality of awareness you bring to everything that follows. The ancient Egyptians were precise about timing in a way that modern people find difficult to take seriously. But consider this. They built structures, the Great Pyramid, the temples at Karnak, the Ramesseum, that were architecturally calibrated to astronomical events with tolerances that still impress structural engineers today. These were not people who were vague about time. When their texts specify that a morning ritual should begin at the first breath of Ra, meaning at the precise moment before the sun crests the horizon, when the sky lightens but the disk is not yet visible, they were not being poetic, they were being technical. That window, what we might call astronomical dawn, the period before civil dawn, lasting roughly 20 to 40 minutes depending on latitude and season, was considered by Thothian practice to be the most mentally permeable time of day. The boundary between the unconscious processing of sleep and the structured cognition of waking consciousness is thinnest. Before we continue, there's something I want to place in your hands. We've gathered 12 years of Hermetic source material, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Emerald Tablets, and more, stripped of fear bait and rebuilt as a working initiatory sequence into a single 3-volume library for those who feel the pull towards something deeper. Because whether we speak of clearing the field of what was never yours, architecting reality through the 7 Hermetic laws as machinery, or building an auric field with weight that walks into a room ahead of you, one truth remains. Understanding without sequence leaves the ground unowned and nothing moves. This is for anyone who's ready to work the initiation in the order it was always meant to be worked. You'll find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here. I'll give you a moment to do that. The Hermetic texts call this the Hour of Thoth, because Thoth governed transitions between states, between worlds, between modes of knowing. The first component of the ritual is what the texts call the setting of the mind before the body. In practice, this means that before any physical movement, before you stand, before you speak, before you reach for water, you spend a defined period, traditionally measured as the time required to recite a specific invocation 3 times at a deliberate pace, simply observing the quality of your own awareness. Not controlling it, not analyzing it, observing it. The distinction is critical. This is not mindfulness meditation as a relaxation technique. It is a calibration. You are noting where your consciousness actually is before the demands of the day begin pulling it in directions it did not choose. The second component is what I can only describe as structured sound, though sound undersells it. The Hermetic tradition is explicit that the universe came into being through vibration, through the spoken word of a divine intelligence. The Greek logos, the Egyptian hu, the concept of creative utterance runs through every strand of this tradition. In the morning ritual, this takes the form of specific vowel sequences, 7 vowels corresponding to 7 planetary spheres in the classical cosmological model. Not spoken loudly, spoken at the threshold of audibility, barely above a whisper, in a sequence the texts describe as the voice that the ear hears and the body knows. Modern acoustic research on resonance and the vagus nerve would find this description more interesting than dismissive, I'd argue. The third component is what I'll call the inscription of intent, though again, the texts frame it differently. The Hermetic concept here is that every day is a new creation, and you participate in that creation whether you're conscious of it or not. The ritual makes that participation intentional, not by writing affirmations, not by visualizing goals, but by stating with complete precision what mode of knowing you are choosing to inhabit for the coming day. The distinction between "I want to be more focused" and "I choose the faculty of discernment" might sound semantic. In the Hermetic framework, it is everything. You are not expressing a preference. You are aligning your consciousness with a specific quality that the tradition believed had an objective existence independent of your preferences. I spent 3 weeks just on this third component alone before I felt I was doing it in a way that matched the intent of the source material. 3 weeks of getting up at astronomical dawn, watching the sky, reciting vowel sequences in near silence, and then trying to articulate a precise mode of knowing, and failing mostly in ways that were genuinely instructive. I want to be honest with you about what the first month of this was actually like. Because if you've watched any of the content online about ancient rituals and morning routines, you've probably encountered a version of this story that goes, "I started the practice, it was difficult at first, but by week 2, I was experiencing profound shifts." That version is almost always a simplification. The first 30 days of running Thoth's morning ritual were not a gentle difficulty curve. They were, in specific ways, genuinely disorienting. The first thing I noticed within the first week was sleep disruption. Not insomnia, something more precise than that. I was waking up naturally about 15 minutes before my alarm, which was set for astronomical dawn. Not gradually over time, from day 3. This happened with a regularity that I eventually stopped being able to attribute to coincidence. The Hermetic text suggests that engaging with the hour of Thoth as a consistent practice begins to synchronize the practitioner's biological rhythms with solar patterns, that the body, trained repeatedly to observe a specific astronomical threshold, begins to anticipate it. I can't make a scientific claim about the mechanism. I can tell you the experience was real and reproducible. The second thing, and this was the part that genuinely unsettled me, was what happened during the first component, the observing of awareness before movement. By the end of week 2, this part of the practice had become almost unbearable to sustain. Not because it was difficult to stay still, because of what I was actually noticing when I paid attention to the quality of my awareness before the day had shaped it. There was a clarity there that I found uncomfortable. Like walking into a room you've lived in for years and suddenly seeing it in honest light for the first time. The gap between who I was in that raw, pre-social morning state and who I became within an hour of starting the ordinary day was wider than I was prepared to acknowledge. I remember it was around day 18, sitting in that pre-dawn stillness, having completed the vowel sequence, moving into the inscription of intent, and completely freezing. Not because I didn't know what to say, because I realized I didn't know what I actually valued enough to name as a mode of knowing. I've been operating on inherited defaults for so long that the moment the ritual asked me to be precise, I had nothing precise to offer. That was a useful crisis, but it was a crisis. The Hermetic tradition has a name for this phase. It's described in the Corpus Hermeticum as the experience of the dark of knowing. Not ignorance, which is simply the absence of information, but the recognition of the limits of your current epistemic framework. You don't know what you don't know until a practice specifically designed to expose that gap does exactly that. I've had a viewer, someone who'd been following the channel since the early videos on the Kybalion, comment on a previous episode with something that stuck with me. They said that every serious Hermetic practice they'd attempted had felt for the first month like it was subtracting rather than adding. I think that's the most accurate description I've encountered. You don't begin to gain clarity. You begin to lose the comfortable fog you'd been mistaking for it. Around day 22, something shifted in the vowel sequence practice. I can't point to a specific cause, but the 7-vowel sequence, which had felt, if I'm honest, slightly ridiculous for the first 2 weeks, a grown adult whispering into pre-dawn air, stopped feeling like performance and started feeling like calibration. There was a physical dimension to it that I hadn't expected. The ancient texts reference a gathering of the body's attention that precedes genuine conscious awareness. I'd read that phrase a dozen times before I understood it experientially. When the sound is produced at the right frequency, at the right threshold of audibility, with the diaphragm engaged in the specific way the older instructional material describes, you feel it. Not metaphorically. There is a physical quality to the resonance that seems to collect scattered awareness and bring it into a single point. By day 30, I had established a baseline I hadn't had before. Not enlightenment, not transformation, a baseline. A reliable daily starting point from which the rest of the day's cognition was measurably, to me, subjectively, more coherent. I was making fewer impulsive decisions. Not because I'd become more disciplined in any conventional sense, but because the gap between stimulus and response that the ritual was training had actually widened. Slightly, measurably, enough to notice. I personally think this is the most underrated dimension of any genuine Hermetic practice. Not the dramatic experiences that make for compelling stories, but the quiet structural changes in how your cognition operates that accumulate below the threshold of drama and then suddenly become undeniable. You don't feel awakened, you feel calibrated. And calibration, once you've experienced it, is something you protect. Here's something most people who stumble across the Hermetic tradition never fully reckon with. The morning ritual attributed to Thoth isn't a loosely assembled collection of breathwork and silence. It's architecturally precise. Every element maps onto a specific principle from the Hermetic framework, and once you see the mapping, you can't unsee it. The ritual stops being a routine and starts being a living diagram of the philosophy itself. Let's start with the principle of mentalism, the foundational Hermetic claim that all reality is, at root, mental in nature. The ritual begins in darkness and silence, not for aesthetic reasons, but because the practitioner must encounter the mind before the world floods it with content. The first act of the ritual, sitting without stimulation, without agenda, without language, is a direct enactment of this principle. You are training yourself, morning after morning, to locate the observer before the observed. The mind before the phenomena the mind produces. Most of us begin our days by immediately consuming light, sound, news, other people's thoughts. The ritual inverts this entirely. You contact the substrate first. Everything else comes after. The second principle, correspondence, is where things get philosophically interesting. As above, so below. As within, so without. The ritual's breathing sequence, particularly the structured inhale, hold, exhale pattern, is designed to produce a correspondence between the body's rhythmic state and what the Hermeticists described as the rhythm of universal intelligence. This isn't mystical hand-waving. There's a coherence model embedded here. When your internal rhythmic state becomes ordered, your perception of the external world reorganizes accordingly. The Hermetic claim is that this reorganization isn't metaphorical, it's structural. The outer world hasn't changed, but your capacity to perceive pattern, relationship, and meaning within it has been recalibrated. That's correspondence made operational. Vibration, the third principle, explains why the vocal component of the ritual exists at all. The Hermetic system holds that everything in existence is in motion, everything vibrates, and that differences in vibratory rate account for differences in the apparent nature of things. Sound, particularly voiced sound produced with intentional focus, is a direct intervention in vibratory reality. The specific tones used in the ritual, low, resonant, held, aren't arbitrary. They correspond to frequencies the Hermetic tradition associated with grounded states of awareness, with the lower registers of what they called divine intelligence. You're not chanting for ambiance, you're using your body as a tuning instrument. Polarity, the fourth principle, is addressed through the ritual's most counterintuitive element, the deliberate contemplation of opposing states. Practitioners are instructed to hold simultaneously in awareness the idea of stillness and motion, of knowing and unknowing, of presence and dissolution. This isn't meant to be intellectually comfortable. It's meant to train the mind to operate at a higher register than binary either-or processing, to hold paradox without collapsing it prematurely into resolution. Before we continue, some of what I've learned simply never makes it onto YouTube. That's why we have Insights Academy, a free newsletter where I go deeper into hidden knowledge, ancient wisdom, metaphysics, and the nature of consciousness, the knowledge we don't share in these videos. And when you sign up, you'll receive the Kabbalion as a welcome gift. You'll find it through the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I'll give you a moment to do that. After about 3 weeks of practicing this element consistently, I noticed something. My default cognitive response to problems that felt unsolvable had shifted. Instead of forcing an immediate resolution, I found I could hold the tension longer. And in that extended holding, solutions that hadn't been visible before began to surface. I'm not attributing this to anything supernatural. The training was structural, but the effect was real. Rhythm, the fifth principle, is perhaps the most obvious in its application. The ritual only works if it's practiced rhythmically, meaning at the same time, in the same sequence, with the same architecture, day after day. Thoth's framework, as preserved in Hermetic texts, makes clear that irregular practice doesn't produce cumulative effect. The rhythm of repetition is itself the mechanism. Each day's practice builds on the previous days, not through intellectual accumulation, but through what you might call resonant layering. Each session deepens the groove cut by the last, until the state the ritual produces begins to arise more quickly, more fully, more automatically. Cause and effect, the sixth principle, is the one the modern mind finds most intuitive and yet most persistently misapplies. The Hermetic system insists that nothing happens by chance, that every condition is the effect of a prior cause. The ritual is designed to make the practitioner the cause rather than the effect in their own experience. Most of us move through our days as reactive systems. We respond to stimuli, we're shaped by circumstances, we're pulled along by whatever force happens to be strongest in a given moment. The ritual interrupts this. Every morning you exercise deliberate causation. You choose the state you enter the day in. Over 90 days, this compounds. You stop waiting to see what kind of day you're going to have. You start generating it. The seventh principle, gender, is the most frequently misunderstood, and it has nothing to do with biological sex. In the Hermetic framework, gender refers to the interplay of generative and receptive principles in all things. The ritual encodes this in its structure. The receptive phases, silence, stillness, listening, alternate with the generative phases, breath, tone, focused intention. Neither dominates. The practitioner is trained to move fluidly between generating and receiving, between projecting and absorbing. This is, in the Hermetic view, how all genuine creative intelligence operates. Not in the constant push of masculine-coded productivity culture, not in the passive drift of disengagement, but in the disciplined alternation between the two. I want to be precise here, because imprecision on this topic is exactly what keeps the conversation shallow. When we talk about Thoth's ritual being forbidden or suppressed, we're not describing a single dramatic moment in history when a council of powerful men decided to lock a document in a vault. The suppression is more diffuse than that, and more interesting. It operates at the level of epistemological gatekeeping, deciding in advance what categories of knowledge are legitimate and which are pre-classified as unserious. That's a softer and far more effective form of suppression than burning books. The early Christian synthesis that consolidated in the first several centuries of the Common Era had a structural problem with Hermetic knowledge. Not because Hermeticism was obviously dangerous in the way that competing political systems are dangerous, but because it offered an alternate route to the divine that didn't require institutional mediation. This is the key point that gets lost when people reduce the history to a simple conflict between religion and mysticism. The conflict was never primarily theological, it was logistical. A system that teaches individuals to access divine intelligence through structured personal practice is, by definition, a system that doesn't need priests, hierarchies, or sanctioned intermediaries. That's not a theological threat, that's an institutional threat. And institutional threats get suppressed with institutional efficiency. I spent a significant amount of time going through the historical record on this, several weeks cross-referencing primary texts, secondary scholarship, and the fragmentary survival history of the Hermetic corpus. And what struck me most wasn't the moments of overt persecution, it was the moments of strategic absorption. The Roman intellectual establishment didn't simply attack Hermeticism. In many cases, it attempted to integrate it, hollow it out, and redeploy its most palatable elements while discarding the core practice. The morning ritual, the daily embodied practice, was the part that most consistently failed to survive these integrations intact. Philosophy could be absorbed, cosmology could be accommodated, but the practice, the thing you actually did with your body and your attention every morning before the day began, that was the part that kept getting dropped. This is a pattern that repeats across traditions. I've covered related threads in previous videos, including the episode on the Nag Hammadi library, and what its contents reveal about which streams of early alternative knowledge were systematically marginalized. The pattern is consistent. The intellectual content gets preserved, often deliberately, sometimes in distorted form. The practice gets severed from it. And a system without its practice is a map without a territory. It can be studied, it can be argued about, it can be displayed in museums, but it can't do what it was designed to do. The Kybalion, the early 20th century text that distilled much of the Hermetic framework into accessible principles, is itself an example of this pattern operating in the modern era. The book circulates widely. The philosophy it contains is extraordinary. But the book is almost entirely theoretical. It describes the principles with precision and insight. It provides almost no guidance on how to actually instantiate those principles in the body and in daily cognition through structured morning practice. That omission is either an oversight or a choice. Given that the authors, writing under the collective pseudonym Three Initiates, clearly had deep familiarity with the tradition, the most honest interpretation is that it was a choice. Whether deliberate or culturally conditioned, the practice got left out again. And this brings me to the dimension of the suppression that I find most worth naming directly: the modern academic reflex to dismiss the practice dimension of Hermetic knowledge as folk mysticism, as unsophisticated, as the remnant of pre-scientific thinking that the intellectual content has by now outgrown. This reflex is wrong. Not because the practice is beyond scrutiny, it should be scrutinized, but because the reflex itself is doing the same work that institutional suppression did in earlier centuries. It's pre-classifying the practice as unworthy of serious investigation before any investigation has taken place. That's not skepticism. That's gatekeeping with academic credentials attached. What 90 days of the practice itself revealed, and I'm reporting this as an empirical observation about my own experience, not as a claim about universal metaphysical truth, is that the practice cannot be adequately evaluated from outside the practice. This is not an evasion. It's a structural feature of experiential knowledge systems that epistemologists have a name for: knowledge by acquaintance versus knowledge by description. You can describe the color red with perfect linguistic precision to someone who has never seen color. They will understand the description. They will not know red. Thoth's ritual belongs to the category of knowledge that requires acquaintance. The suppression works precisely because it keeps people at the level of description, reading about it, critiquing it, forming opinions about it, without ever doing the one thing that would produce actual data: practicing it consistently in the dark, before the world has a chance to flood the mind with its noise. There's a threshold that serious practitioners of any structured contemplative discipline describe, and I was skeptical of it until I crossed it myself, where the relationship between you and the practice inverts. You stop practicing the ritual starts practicing you. I hit this somewhere between day 58 and day 63, and I'm being deliberately imprecise about the exact day because the shift wasn't a moment. It was a gradient. And then it was undeniable. Here's what that inversion actually looks like in functional terms, because I want to be specific rather than mystical about it. Up through roughly day 55, I was executing the ritual. Each morning, I was making a series of choices: to sit, to breathe in the prescribed pattern, to vocalize, to hold the silence, to work through the contemplative sequence. These were deliberate acts. They required will. Some mornings they required significant will, the kind of will that wakes up before the alarm goes off and asks whether all of this is worth it. Around day 60, the structure of the experience changed. I wasn't executing the practice anymore. The practice was executing through me. My body began moving through the sequence before my conscious mind had formally decided to begin. I'd wake up, and before any deliberation had occurred, I was already sitting in position. The breath pattern began without instruction. The silence arose without effort. This sounds like habit formation, and it is, partially. But it's not only that, because the quality of the states the ritual was producing had also changed. The early weeks produced effort, followed by stillness. The later weeks produced stillness that was already present before the effort began. The ritual was less a process of arriving somewhere and more a process of recognizing that I was already there. The seventh principle, gender, in Hermetic terms, had fully materialized as lived experience by this point. I was no longer alternating consciously between the generative and receptive phases of the practice. They had integrated into something that felt less like alternation and more like a single coherent movement. The Hermetic texts describe this integration as the mark of advanced practice, not a supernatural achievement, but a calibration of attention so refined that the distinction between the practitioner and the practice becomes, for the duration of the session, operationally irrelevant. That's an unusual sentence. I know it sounds abstract, but if you've spent time in any serious contemplative practice, whether Hermetic or otherwise, you'll recognize the description immediately. I'm Daniel, and this is Hermetic Talk. And I want to be clear that I'm not reporting these later stage experiences as evidence of anything transcendent. I'm reporting them because they're what actually happened, and the intellectual honesty the subject demands requires me to describe the data accurately, including the parts that don't fit neatly into conventional cognitive frameworks. By day 75, something else had emerged that I hadn't anticipated, and that no description of the ritual I'd encountered had adequately prepared me for. A change in the texture of time. Not its duration. I wasn't experiencing time as longer or shorter in any measurable sense, but its density. Ordinary moments in the day began to carry more informational weight. A conversation that would previously have registered as unremarkable would arrive with, there's no other way to say this, more dimensionality. I was perceiving more within the same perceptual field. The Hermetic framework has a precise term for this: the opening of the nous, the divine intelligence faculty that classical Hermetic texts describe as the instrument through which reality is apprehended in its deeper structure rather than only its surface appearance. I want to be careful here not to claim more than the experience warrants. I'm not asserting that I achieved some permanent elevated state. What I'm describing is a consistent, morning-anchored shift in perceptual quality that carried forward into the day with decreasing intensity as the day progressed. By evening, the effect had largely dissipated. The next morning, the ritual reactivated it. This was the cycle. Daily reactivation of a perceptual state that, practiced consistently enough, appeared to be slowly and incrementally extending its duration and its depth. By day 90, the most significant change wasn't dramatic, it was architectural. The baseline from which I was operating, my resting cognitive and perceptual state when nothing in particular was happening, had shifted upward in a way that was difficult to quantify but impossible to deny. Situations that would previously have triggered automatic reactive responses were now meeting a different version of me. Not a calmer version in the superficial, disengaged sense, a more present version. The Hermetic tradition describes the ultimate aim of such practice as becoming, in a very specific sense, more awake. Not to altered states, but to ordinary reality encountered with the full faculty of attention available. That is what day 90 looked like. Not transcendence, presence. Full, operational, unhurried presence. Which, as it turns out, is far rarer and more valuable than any dramatic mystical experience I could have reported. Let's step back from the personal account and look at the larger question, because the 90-day experiment is interesting, but the reason it's worth talking about on a channel dedicated to Hermetic tradition is that Thoth's ritual is pointing at something that extends well beyond personal optimization. The ritual isn't primarily self-help. It's a technology for a specific kind of human development that the Hermetic tradition considered both achievable and urgent. And the urgency they attach to it maps, with uncomfortable precision, onto the conditions of the present moment. The Hermetic corpus, and here I'm drawing on the corpus Hermeticum itself, particularly the dialogues attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, describes humanity as existing in a state of fundamental amnesia. Not ignorance, which implies simply a lack of information. Amnesia, a forgetting of what we fundamentally are. The texts are insistent on this point. Human beings, in the Hermetic view, carry within them a faculty of divine intelligence, the nous, that most people never develop or access because the conditions of ordinary life don't require it and don't cultivate it. The morning ritual is, in the most direct sense, a daily counterpressure against this amnesia. It's a structured practice designed to wake up the faculty that ordinary civilization progressively puts to sleep. Now consider what ordinary civilization is doing to human attention right now. The environmental conditions of early 21st century life are, from a hermetic perspective, almost perfectly engineered to deepen the amnesia. Continuous partial attention. Algorithmic stimulation sequences calibrated to maximize reactive engagement and minimize reflective depth. Information environments that reward speed of response over quality of cognition. The Hermetic texts didn't anticipate smartphones, but they described, with impressive precision, the conditions of mind that prevent genuine intellectual and spiritual development. Distraction. Excessive engagement with surface phenomena. The mistaking of received opinion for genuine understanding. The prioritization of comfort over clarity. A viewer named Marcus reached out after my previous video on the Emerald Tablet and asked a question that stayed with me. If the Hermetic tradition has always known that these conditions arise in civilizations, why didn't it produce a more robust institutional resistance to them? It's a sharp question, and the answer, I think, is that the Hermetic tradition always understood that institutional resistance is the wrong instrument for this problem. You can't resist distraction at scale by building an institution dedicated to opposing distraction. Institutions become distraction. The response the tradition encoded was always individual and always practice-based. A specific structure you do with your body and your attention every morning before the world establishes its terms. That's not a failure of ambition. That's an accurate assessment of where genuine change actually happens. This is why the ritual survived at all, in fragments, in coded references, in traditions that preserved the practice without always preserving its original attribution. Something that actually works at the individual level doesn't require institutional infrastructure to persist. People practice it. They find that it changes things. They teach it to others who find that it changes things. The channel of transmission is direct experience, not organizational maintenance. What Thoth's ritual is building across its 7 structural elements, across the 90 days of consistent practice, and presumably across the years and decades of more committed practice that I haven't yet undertaken, is what the Hermetic tradition calls the solar body. This is not a physical structure. It's a coherent, disciplined, awake form of selfhood that can operate in the world without being entirely determined by the world's terms. The solar body analogy is precise. Just as the sun illuminates without being dependent on what it illuminates, the developed Hermetic practitioner perceives and engages with reality without being entirely shaped by whatever reality happens to be presenting. This is not detachment in the passive, disengaged sense. It's a specific form of engaged non-reactivity, presence without captivity. The reason this matters now, specifically now, in this particular cultural moment, is that the conditions working against this development have never been more sophisticated or more pervasive. And the evidence that conventional responses to those conditions are insufficient continues to accumulate at scale. We have more information than any civilization in history and less apparent wisdom about what to do with it. We have more connection than any previous generation, and less evidence that the connection is producing the clarity that genuine human relationship is supposed to generate. Thoth's forbidden morning ritual is not a solution to this at a civilizational level. It's not a policy. It can't be scaled in any conventional sense. What it is, and what 90 days of practicing it demonstrated to me with unmistakable clarity, is a proof of concept. A demonstration that the faculty the Hermetic tradition has always said is latent in human beings can, in fact, be activated. Not through belief, not through intellectual agreement with the philosophical framework, through the daily, embodied, pre-dawn practice of meeting your own mind before the world gets to it first. Thoth didn't forbid this ritual. He preserved it. The question is whether we're willing to receive what was preserved and do what preservation requires. Practice it, in the dark, before the noise begins, for long enough that it starts practicing us.